Llevo muchos años hablando de accesibilidad y esta charla me ha servido como de oportunidad de explorar el tópico de un ángulo un poco diferente. ¿Y ahora? Pasando al inglés. So I wanted to talk about three things we assume about our users, three very, very simple things that we still do every day. There's never been a better time to be a designer. You can see this as designer to developer ratio and how it's changed through the years. We have entire companies like Accenture and Ernst & Young buying entire design agencies. So demand also meant that the salaries have increased, and we have, for example, chief design officers representing design and user experience at the very highest level. However, now that we've got the power, we've not necessarily realized that we also have more responsibility. So it's having more people in design and having more demand for design and design leaders did not mean that our designs are more diverse and are better at serving our audiences. So for example, there are lots of scandals that came out in the last few years. There was one doctor in the UK, in Cambridge. She signed up to a gym and she couldn't understand why her pass wouldn't let her into the changing rooms. And later on she was told that it's because the software associated, or everyone who had title doctor automatically assumed that they were males, as you do. There are other examples. For example, photo recognition algorithms that only work for white faces. And actually, if you look at the history of Kodak, you will see that it hasn't considered people who were non-white until furniture and chocolate makers brought to the attention that their products were not turning out well in marketing materials. And we have things like social media being used as political weapons. Many, many examples, as I'm sure you'll hear today. And again, as I'm sure we'll hear more and have heard today, the reason why we should really start thinking about this stuff is because any bias in data becomes bias in algorithms. And we don't necessarily have to be designing algorithms to start thinking about biases. So the first thing that we assume is that our users look just like us. At the end of last year, I received a email alert for a job in Barcelona for a UX researcher. And I thought I was really excited because I've been monitoring jobs for a long time in Barcelona. I live in London, but my partner lives here, so I've been kind of going back and forth for more than 10 years now. And I thought, cool, that's a sign of maturity, finding someone who wants to talk about users. Maybe I'll work in a good team that focuses on that. But this was not to be. The website that I got to had something like this. So I didn't use the actual website, but it had a picture of 5 white young guys having a great time. And it said recruitment for creative people. And you can see here it's actually the most epic debate apparently in history, the panels of Titans. So just like the Titans, it comes from a great website called All Male Panels, where you can report things like that. Thankfully, volunteers have done a great job today, lineup of speakers that doesn't look like this. So obviously it was unintentional, and you may think, okay, it's a small company, it's a recruitment agency based in the UK, they just, that's what they look like. Maybe that doesn't seem like much. Saying that they did pay a lot of attention to their transitions on the website, and there was like parallax scrolling on all that, not enough to diversity. And sadly, this is not just one website. You can see statistics where women are underrepresented at the top. And it's not just women, it's also people who are non-white. It gets worse as you go higher up into the leadership space. So things that put them off are things that you see there. Bro culture, lack of role models. Like, we can flip it and imagine that what if the most epic debate looked like this? And then we'd have 6 white males talking about being underpaid. It's a real story, but I flipped the photos. I mean, hopefully this makes the bias much clearer. There are some good examples. So, for example, Guardian released last year this calendar where it shows on which date women stop being paid. In the US, they celebrate the gender gap pay in April. In the UK, they celebrate the same day somewhere in November. That means that if you're a female in the UK, I can stop working in November. Not quite, but. So legislation forces companies to release data like this. Other companies have been doing good things. For example, companies like Penguin, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Ernst & Young, and Deloitte. They all are attracting much wider, at least in the UK, they scrapped their requirements for degrees. So this means that they are employing people who are more representative of society as a whole. Second thing that we still assume is that everyone fits into a box that we've designed for them, that we want them to fill in, probably so that we can start targeting them with stuff that we want to sell them. So lots of binary choices on forms. In the US, there was no mixed race option in the census until the year 2000. There is still, in the vast majority of forms, there's still no recognition that gender is a spectrum. For example, it may sound like in our generation it's not that prominent. It's less than 1% that people who don't identify as male or female. But in younger generation, there's much more awareness, and as far as percentages of non-gender binary people is as high as 17%. Names that are too long or names that are too short. So basically, it's okay if we're part of the default option, but there are many people out there who are not the default. So have a guess what these things have in common. It's one of my favorite ones. You need a NIE. De identidad de extranjero. There are whole industries out there. You can, there is no clarity what data you need. This person is saying on the expat forum, and it's just one of many, many examples. People don't know how to get those numbers, how long to wait. You may have to return back home before even getting an appointment. And according to one report, 60% of Barcelona is born abroad. So I think as a minimum, this is excluding a lot of people from using very basic services like buying something online. I think on the other end, for example, legislation like GDPR was put in place to make sure that we only ever collect the information that we actually need. And I think the other thing that's wrong with asking for more data is there'll always be people, if I want to use a BSync, I'll have to find a way. If I want to go to a yoga class, I'll have to find a way. And that means that the data that they're actually collecting is useless. It's not really, it doesn't have any integrity. So one of the things that we do at the Ministry of Justice, and these are actually UK government design principles, there are 10 of them. I'm designing a very, very complicated form for people to apply for legal aid, ayuda legal. And one of the things that we do is we always start with user needs. So we're asking ourselves what it is that people actually need to tell us. We work with legislation that help us understand what it is that we actually need to gather from the legislative perspective. We look at every single question and we look at data. So if, for example, 0.06% of people have second property or have jewelry that is expensive, we look at ways of hiding that data. And one of the other principles is this is for everyone. So as a government agency, you have no choice. There is no alternative way to get your passport or to get a driving license. There is no kind of hidden industry where you can pay someone to do it for you. So it's important to keep that in mind. And with that, we can cut the number of questions in half often, and that means that the chances of people getting to the end of the process are much higher. The third thing we assume is that people can can understand and they can handle complexity. I'm sure you've seen some numbers and you'll see some numbers. Really big percentages of people struggle with basic literacy. So for example, the people who struggle with, or people who have low literacy and or low numeracy have trouble understanding how to take medicine instructions, or how much petrol they have in the bank. These figures are from 2012. It'll be interesting to see how they change. Between 5 and 20% of population have dyslexia, and this again translates into millions of people. So this is again one of my favorite examples, really, really simple to fix. You can see a lot of the time text is justified on both sides, coming from print industry, where you actually have typesetting that intelligently can prevent things like rivers of white. So if you're a person with dyslexia, what you can see here is just the white space standing out, and it makes it really, really hard to read. A very simple fix. One of the things that they are doing in NHS Digital is they're using very, very simple language that their users can understand. They're using words like pee and poop, so pipi y caca, because they realize that this is the kind of language that their audiences use. Some people didn't like these words, but for example, if you have blood in your poo, this can easily save someone's life. We don't have to go to the extremes of NHS, but there are very clear kind of discussions that we can have with, for example, marketing, who are obsessed with these brand names and that people can't actually understand. Again, also naming services is very, very important. In summary, these are the basic three things that we assume about people. And sometimes you may hear, sometimes you think, oh, this is you being a sensitive snowflake. But I think if you keep finding yourself outside of the default, this really starts to get to you, and you're feeling very excluded from society. So why are we behaving like this? In preparation for this talk, I found this great article by Buster Benson, who spent a long, long time looking at the list of biases on Wikipedia, and he actually grouped them. So very simply, he simplified that massive list of biases to, there's a lot of information, but we are bombarded with information, so we take mental shortcuts all the time. We need to act fast, so we have to fill the gap, and we make assumptions. And for that, we just use data and information that is top of our minds. So for example, false consensus bias tells us that others agree with me. And if you're surrounded by people from the same cultural background, you're more likely to think that, just like someone mentioned before. Illusory superiority bias tells us that I'm better than others. We overestimate our own ability. Overconfidence effect tells us that we're right. And some of these companies have been involved in those scandals, have gained success very, very quickly. So this was just confirming the fact that they were right to behave like they did. This is the bias that will help us get through this. So if you break a hand, or you buy a bicycle, or you're pregnant, suddenly you start seeing people around you who are also, riding that Brompton, or are pregnant, or broke their hand. So just by recognizing this information, we will start seeing it in more places. So I think the first thing that we can do is just to recognize historical biases, and to recognize and observe our own biases by learning about them and by observing how we feel. There are some people who talk about reflexive practice. So as a user researcher or as a designer, we need to recognize, how am I feeling about this subject? How am I feeling today? Am I projecting my personal stuff onto my work? Am I avoiding certain topics? And also observing how the kind of practices that we have in our workplace. The 5 guys who had a great time recruiting, hopefully everyone, not just the creative people that look like them. They actually took that photo down. I emailed them. I don't know if that's the reason why they took it down. But I think sometimes just having that realization will go a long way. The second thing that we can do is to use our status and privilege to challenge this. We need to be brave and also smart. For example, can you start saying no when you are tasked with designing what's known as a dark pattern? Or can we be clever in such a way that the stakeholder or the business or whoever asks you to do something that you think will harm users is a way around it? So I worked on a project that helped transform a charity in the UK. It was for people with terminal illness and their family where they could find advice. So at the time I thought this was the hardest thing to do, and that involved simply presenting those personas to fundraising department. What we tried to do is we didn't just make them like the United Colors of Benetton. We actually, there was important reason to include people like this. For example, we learned that in Asian communities in the UK, there's a big stigma about taking their family members to hospices. You are seen as a failed as a family. You can see Emily Strong there has 2 young sons. That was the point of having young people was to unpack the theme of a young carer. Fundraising department didn't like those personas. They just, Priya was meant to be at the top. She was meant to be the main one, but they wanted to see Dorothy. But I'm quite happy with how it turned out, because in the end, just by changing their names and by making the white person the main persona, at the time it was good enough. And it still allowed us to have those personas, to have them land in the company. And then in a few months, the organization started changing and they became much more diverse. I'm not saying this was because of the personas, but probably fundraising was kind of running out of time, and we were there at the right time. I think this other one is about being kind to yourself, because designing for difference, and it means that we're often at the cutting edge of change. It means that people around us don't always understand why it is important to challenge stereotypes and challenging our biases. So for example, in medical profession, nurses and doctors are taught to be resilient, and this is something that we can also apply on ourselves, finding ways to bounce back. This is one of my favorite posters at the Ministry of Justice. This is Sir Alan Turing, who was a mathematician and a genius. He was homosexual and he lost his life too early. So my final point is that designing for difference is really hard, but it's probably not as hard as losing your life to being different, and we should give it our best go. So thanks to all these people and to the volunteers and to all of you for being here.